My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 32 years old, the founder of a mental health platform for women. And I never planned to tell this story. Everything collapsed the night my mother called, her voice shaking, saying the family needed to see me immediately because something couldn't be ignored anymore. Minutes later, I found out why. The person I reported when I was 17 was back at a family gathering. And everyone was acting like nothing had ever happened. I stood there while my sister leaned in and said it would be better if I stayed quiet again. For everyone's peace. In that moment, I realized the betrayal wasn't loud or dramatic. It was calm, agreed upon, and final. I chose to walk away. Not by slowly fading out this time, but by cutting the cord completely. With no return. As I closed my car door, my phone started vibrating nonstop. And then there was a sharp knock on the window beside me. If you want to know what happened right after that, stay with me for a moment. To understand why that knock mattered so much, I need to take you back to where this really began. To when I was the daughter everyone said was strong enough not to need protection. I learned very early that being called strong was not a compliment. It was a way of explaining why no one needed to check on me. Why my silence was praised. Why my discomfort was treated like a personal flaw instead of a signal. In my family, strength meant you absorbed things quietly. You didn't interrupt dinner. You didn't ask for explanations. You didn't make situations uncomfortable. Strength meant you carried what was handed to you and pretended it didn't weigh anything at all. If any part of that sounds familiar, you can stay with me as I go on. I won't rush this part. When I think back to my childhood, there are no obvious disasters. No screaming matches that neighbors overheard. No dramatic exits. What there was instead was a constant calibration of myself. I learned how much space my emotions were allowed to take up in a room. I learned how to speak in ways that didn't invite questions. I learned how to sense when my presence was tolerated rather than wanted. Those skills don't come from nowhere. They are learned through repetition. Through small moments that tell you who matters and who adapts. My sister Emily never had to adapt. She arrived in rooms like the room had been waiting for her. People turned toward her voice without realizing they were doing it. When she laughed, adults laughed too. When she cried, everything paused. I don't think she planned it. Some people are simply mirrored back to themselves more clearly by the world. I was not one of those people. I learned to watch instead. I learned to read tone, posture, silence. I became very good at understanding what people meant without them having to say it. My mother liked to tell friends that we were opposites. Emily was emotional and expressive. I was calm and logical. She needed reassurance. I needed independence. This story made her look thoughtful, like a parent who understood her children deeply. What it left out was that these traits were not natural categories. They were outcomes. One of us was allowed to ask for care. The other was rewarded for not needing it. My father rarely entered these conversations. He believed in keeping things simple. He believed that families worked best when everyone did their part and didn't dwell on feelings too much. He liked order. He liked peace. And peace, in our house, meant that whatever Emily needed came first. And whatever I needed could wait. Or disappear. Or be redefined as something I shouldn't need at all. I don't remember a specific moment when this became clear to me. It was more like gravity. Always there, shaping the way things fell. If Emily was upset, it was treated as urgent. If I was upset, it was treated as puzzling. My reactions were analyzed instead of addressed. My tone was questioned instead of my experience. Over time, I internalized a quiet lesson. If I could explain myself well enough, calmly enough, reasonably enough, then maybe I would be heard. If not, then the problem was me. That belief followed me everywhere. At school, teachers described me as mature. Friends called me the reliable one. I became the person people leaned on without asking whether I was leaning on anything myself. I wore that identity carefully. It protected me. It also erased me. There is a particular loneliness that comes from being admired for how little you ask for. It looks like approval from the outside. It feels like invisibility from the inside. By the time I was a teenager, I had learned how to disappear in plain sight. I went to class. I got good grades. I participated just enough. At home, I stayed out of the way. I learned the schedules of the house so I could move through rooms without colliding with anyone's mood. I thought this was normal. I thought this was what harmony looked like. I didn't yet have the language to call it avoidance, or emotional economy, or conditional belonging. There were moments when I almost spoke up. Small openings where I felt something press against my chest, asking to be named. Each time, I watched how those moments ended for other people. I saw how discomfort was smoothed over. How inconvenient truths were reframed as misunderstandings. How silence was praised as maturity. I learned from observation that telling the truth was not the same thing as being believed. And that belief often had less to do with facts than with what the group could tolerate. When I was 17, I thought I had finally misjudged that calculation. I thought that surely this time, the thing I needed to say was big enough to matter. Surely this time, being calm and clear and honest would be enough. I prepared my words carefully. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I chose language that felt responsible and restrained. I believed, deeply, that if I presented my experience the right way, it would be received with care. What I did not understand then was that my family's stability depended on not hearing me. There are systems that only work as long as certain people remain quiet. I was one of those people. When I spoke, I didn't just introduce information. I introduced risk. I threatened an image that had been carefully maintained. And when image and truth collide, image usually wins. The response was not anger. That would have been easier to name. The response was concern, confusion, questions that circled but never landed. I was asked if I was sure. If I might have misunderstood. If stress had made things feel bigger than they were. No one said I was lying. They didn't have to. The effect was the same. My certainty was slowly dissolved by other people's doubt, until I began to feel reckless for having trusted myself at all. I remember sitting at the kitchen table afterward, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, feeling something settle into place. It wasn't devastation. It was clarity. I understood then that there were truths I could not carry into that house without losing my place in it. I also understood that keeping my place would require me to lose something else. I didn't yet know what that loss would cost me over time. I only knew that the door I had hoped would open had quietly closed. From that point on, I became a study in restraint. I stopped bringing my inner life home. I edited myself before anyone else could. I told people I was fine because it made conversations shorter. I told myself that independence was the same thing as freedom. It would take years for me to realize that independence born from neglect feels very different from independence chosen freely. Leaving home after high school felt less like a rebellion and more like a logical conclusion. There was no fight, no dramatic goodbye. I packed my things, hugged my parents, wished my sister luck, and stepped into a life that required me to build everything from scratch. I told myself this was growth. I told myself this was what capable people did. I did not yet recognize how much of my drive was fueled by the need to prove that I could survive without ever needing to ask for help. Those early years were a blur of effort. Work, classes, late nights, constant motion. When you don't slow down, feelings have trouble catching up to you. That was the theory, at least. In practice, they waited. They surfaced in quiet moments. In my chest, tightening without explanation. In my thoughts, looping late at night. I learned new words then. Anxiety, panic, hypervigilance. They described patterns I recognized immediately, even if I didn't know how to interrupt them yet. Therapy was not an instant revelation. It was uncomfortable and slow. It asked me questions I had learned not to answer. It asked me to sit with sensations I had spent years outrunning. There were sessions where I spoke fluently and felt nothing. There were sessions where I said very little and felt everything. Progress did not move in a straight line. It circled. It stalled. It surprised me. What it did, consistently, was give me language. And language, I would learn, changes what you can see. As I began to understand myself differently, I also began to see patterns outside of me. In classrooms, in offices, in conversations between women who lowered their voices when they spoke about harm. As if volume determined credibility. I noticed how often clarity was punished when it disrupted comfort. How often composure was demanded from the very people who had been destabilized. I saw myself everywhere, not in faces, but in posture, in the way women sat with their shoulders slightly forward, prepared to make themselves smaller if necessary. This is where the idea that would later shape my work first appeared. Not as a business plan. Not as a mission statement. As a question. What would it look like to create a space where explanation was not required to be gentle? Where telling the truth did not have to be palatable to be valid? Where strength was not measured by how little you needed, but by how honestly you could name what you had survived? At the time, I didn't think I was building anything. I thought I was trying to make sense of my own internal landscape. I experimented. I listened. I paid attention to what made people exhale when they spoke. I noticed how anonymity changed tone. How safety altered rhythm. These observations mattered to me in a way I couldn't yet articulate. They felt personal. They felt necessary. Throughout all of this, my family remained in my life at a distance. Holiday calls. Polite updates. Carefully curated versions of ourselves exchanged like postcards. I did not bring my inner work into those conversations. I had learned what happened when I did. Instead, I played my assigned role. The capable daughter. The low-maintenance one. The one who was doing fine. There was comfort in the predictability of it. There was also a quiet grief that I carried alone. Looking back now, I see that grief as a signal I didn't yet know how to interpret. It was the cost of maintaining a connection that required my absence. At the time, I called it maturity. I told myself that everyone had limits, and that loving people meant accepting them as they were. What I did not yet understand was that acceptance without reciprocity becomes self-erasure. All of this forms the background of the person I became. Not the public version, but the internal architecture, the habits of self-monitoring, the instinct to minimize, the belief that if something hurt, it was probably because I hadn't explained it well enough yet. These were not dramatic traits. They were quiet, efficient, socially rewarded, and they set the stage for everything that would come later, including the moment when those carefully built structures finally failed me. I didn't know it then, but the life I was constructing, piece by piece, was moving toward a collision between who I had been trained to be and who I was becoming. Between silence and articulation, between peace and truth. The signs were there, subtle but persistent, a tightening before family gatherings, a restlessness I couldn't name, a sense that something unfinished was waiting for me, patient and unmoved by my progress. I carried that feeling with me for years, assuming it was just part of being an adult, assuming that everyone lived with some version of it. It would take a single evening, one phone call, and a familiar tone in my mother's voice to show me how wrong that assumption was, and how carefully my past had been waiting for me to look at it directly. I didn't tell anyone how carefully I managed my contact with my family during those years. From the outside, it looked normal, regular enough calls, holiday visits spaced far enough apart to feel manageable, polite interest exchanged like currency. What it cost me was invisible. Before every interaction, my body prepared itself as if for impact. My breathing shifted, my thoughts narrowed, I edited myself before words even formed. I didn't notice I was doing this until I started noticing when I wasn't. There were places where my shoulders dropped without permission. Conversations where my voice didn't flatten itself into neutrality. Rooms where I could pause mid-thought and not feel the need to apologize for taking time. These moments startled me. They felt indulgent, almost irresponsible. It took a while to realize that ease wasn't something I had to earn. It was something I had been denied. When I thought about my family, I still framed everything in terms of understanding. They didn't mean harm. They did the best they could. They came from a different generation. These explanations made me sound generous. They also kept me from asking harder questions. Questions about responsibility, about accountability, about why the burden of adaptation had always landed on me. My sister and I spoke occasionally, usually through short messages that never went anywhere meaningful. She was busy. She was excited about her life. She shared achievements as if they existed in a vacuum. I responded with encouragement that felt automatic. There was a careful choreography to our exchanges. We avoided the past not because it was resolved, but because it was radioactive. Even silence has rules when everyone agrees not to touch a subject. Sometimes I wondered if she remembered things the way I did. Memory is not neutral. It bends toward comfort. It edits out details that threaten how we see ourselves. I suspected that in her version of events, everything had unfolded reasonably, that my reactions were excessive, that time had smoothed whatever rough edges there had been. This thought made me feel both sad and strangely detached. I stopped needing her to remember correctly. I needed to remember myself. My parents asked questions that skimmed the surface of my life. Work, housing, health. They praised my independence as if it were a moral achievement. I let them. It was easier than explaining that independence had been my only option. That resilience had grown where support should have been. They didn't ask about my inner world. I didn't offer it. We met in the narrow middle where no one risked discomfort. Over time, I built a professional identity that felt more solid than anything else in my life. Work rewarded clarity. Systems responded to analysis. Effort produced measurable results. There was relief in that. I gravitated toward environments where expectations were explicit and feedback was structured. Ambiguity had never been kind to me. I liked knowing where I stood. As I moved deeper into the mental health space, I became increasingly aware of how often women described experiences similar to mine without using the same words. They talked about feeling responsible for other people's emotions, about being labeled difficult when they asked for clarity, about learning to present pain in ways that wouldn't alarm anyone. These conversations didn't feel theoretical. They felt personal. I listened differently because I recognized the terrain. What struck me most was how often doubt appeared after disclosure. Not from strangers, but from people closest to them. Mothers, sisters, partners. Doubt delivered gently, framed as concern. Are you sure? Maybe you misunderstood. That doesn't sound like him. These phrases landed softly and left bruises that took years to identify. I began to see doubt not as a question, but as a strategy, one that preserved existing structures by relocating uncertainty into the person who spoke. I noticed how frequently women apologized before telling the truth, how they softened statements, added disclaimers, explained their tone. I did it too, even after years of therapy and training. The instinct remained. There was always a part of me scanning for how much honesty a room could handle. That part had been trained early. It had kept me safe. It had also kept me small. The more I understood this, the harder it became to participate in my family's version of harmony. The cost was becoming clearer. Every time I chose not to correct a narrative, something in me tightened. Every time I accepted praise for being easy, I felt myself recede. This wasn't a dramatic unraveling. It was a slow accumulation of friction, the kind that wears things down without making noise. I started to pull back in subtle ways. Shorter visits, less availability. I told myself this was practical, that I was busy, that distance was healthy. All of that was true. What I didn't admit was that I was also rehearsing an absence. Testing what it felt like to not show up as expected. The results were mixed. No one confronted me. No one asked what had changed. The system adjusted easily to my partial disappearance. That realization stung more than I expected. At the same time, my internal world was becoming more articulate. I could name patterns without immediately excusing them. I could hold complexity without collapsing into self-blame. This didn't make things easier with my family. It made them sharper. Awareness has a way of stripping comfort from old compromises. I could no longer pretend that silence was neutral. I could see its function too clearly. There were nights when I replayed conversations from years earlier, hearing them with new ears. Not to punish myself, but to understand. I noticed how often I had deferred, how often I had agreed to interpretations that minimized me. These realizations weren't explosive. They were heavy. They settled slowly, changing how I carried myself. I also began to understand that my family was not uniquely flawed. They were ordinary. They valued cohesion. They avoided conflict. They believed love meant maintaining appearances. These values were reinforced by culture, by community, by 1,000 small signals that told them what a good family looked like. In that framework, my discomfort had always been the anomaly. Naming it threatened the picture. This understanding gave me compassion without erasing impact. I could see how the system functioned without excusing what it had required of me. That distinction mattered. It allowed me to stop arguing with reality. To accept that some people would never meet me where I stood. Not because I failed to explain, but because doing so would require them to change. As this clarity settled in, I felt a growing tension between who I was becoming and the role I played when I went home. The gap was widening. I could feel it in my body before I could articulate it in words. A sense of bracing, a subtle dissociation. These were signals I had learned to ignore, but they were getting louder. I didn't know then that a moment was approaching that would force this tension into the open. I only knew that the life I had built was no longer compatible with the silences I maintained. Something had to give. Either my understanding would retreat, or my relationships would have to change. I carried that awareness quietly, unaware of how soon it would be tested. The call came on a weekday evening, which was unusual. My mother preferred weekends, when she could frame conversations as check-ins rather than interruptions. When I saw her name on my phone, my first thought wasn't worry. It was calculation. How much of myself would this require? I let it ring once before answering, buying a second to settle my breath. Her voice sounded controlled, but there was an undercurrent I recognized. A careful softness, the kind she used when she wanted cooperation without resistance. She said there was something important. She said it would be better if I heard it in person. She said the family needed to talk. None of this was said urgently, but the structure of the request carried weight. This was not an invitation. It was a summons wrapped in courtesy. As she spoke, my body reacted before my mind did. A tightening behind my ribs. A familiar pressure at the base of my throat. I noticed it with the detachment I had learned in therapy. Name the sensation. Stay present. But presence doesn't neutralize history. It only makes you aware of it. I asked what it was about. She hesitated, just long enough to signal that she had already decided not to tell me. She said it would be easier to explain face to face. She said it involved someone I knew. That was enough. The old pattern clicked into place. Withholding information as a way to control the terms of engagement. I agreed to come, not because I wanted to, but because I recognized the familiar trap. If I refused, I would be framed as difficult. If I came, I would be expected to be reasonable. The drive there felt longer than it was. I noticed how my thoughts narrowed as I got closer. How my attention shifted outward, scanning for cues, preparing to read the room. This was a version of myself I didn't access anywhere else. Hyper-aware, strategically quiet. It felt like slipping into an old coat that still fit, even though I no longer liked how it looked. When I arrived, the house looked exactly the same. Familiar in a way that was both comforting and disorienting. Nothing in the physical space reflected the years I had lived elsewhere. The work I had done to become someone new. I parked, sat for a moment, and reminded myself that I could leave at any time. That thought felt theoretical. Inside, everyone was already there. My parents, my sister, and him. The sight of him landed without drama. No surge of panic, no rush of anger, just a hollowing out, as if my body had recognized the situation long before my mind caught up. He stood, smiled politely, and nodded, as though this were a normal reunion, as though nothing about his presence carried weight. No one acknowledged the strangeness of it. My mother gestured toward the living room. My father asked about traffic. My sister avoided my eyes. The room arranged itself around the assumption that I would adapt, that I would absorb the discomfort quietly, the way I always had. It was an old choreography, and everyone knew their steps. As we sat, the conversation moved carefully. Updates were exchanged, compliments offered. The air felt thick with what wasn't being said. I noticed how often people looked at me and then away, how my presence seemed to require management. Eventually, my mother explained, he was going to be around more often. There were family events coming up. It would be awkward to exclude him. She said this with the tone of someone presenting an unfortunate but practical reality. I waited for someone to ask how I felt. No one did. Instead, my sister spoke. She said it would be better if we all tried to move forward. She said holding on to the past didn't help anyone. She said we were adults now. Her voice was calm, reasonable. It landed exactly where it was meant to. On me. That was the moment something shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but decisively. I realized that this was not a misunderstanding to be clarified. This was a decision that had already been made. My presence was secondary to convenience. My discomfort was an obstacle to be managed, not a signal to be addressed. I felt the old urge to explain rise up, then stall. I had explained before. I had explained carefully. The outcome had not changed. I became acutely aware of my body in the room. The way I was sitting. The way my hands rested in my lap. I noticed the absence of rage. What I felt instead was a profound clarity. A recognition that the system I was in could not accommodate my truth without dismantling itself. And it would not choose to do that. I spoke then, but not the way I used to. My voice didn't rush. It didn't apologize. I said that I wasn't comfortable with this arrangement. I said that his presence was not neutral for me. I said that moving forward without acknowledging what had happened was not something I could participate in. The room reacted immediately. Subtle shifts. My mother's expression tightened. My father looked down. My sister exhaled sharply, as if I had made something unnecessarily difficult. She said I was putting everyone in an impossible position. She said she understood that I had feelings, but that life was complicated. She said families had to make compromises. The language was familiar. Collective burden. Shared responsibility. The implication was clear. My refusal was the problem. As she spoke, I realized that this was the same argument, just updated for adulthood. The same expectation that I would absorb discomfort for the sake of cohesion. The same framing of my boundaries as obstacles rather than information. I felt something in me settle, like a door closing gently but firmly. I said I wouldn't stay. I said I wasn't asking anyone to choose. I was choosing for myself. There was a pause. In that pause, I felt the weight of years of conditioning press in, urging me to soften, to reconsider, to make it easier for everyone. I didn't. I stood up. The movement felt unreal, as if I were watching someone else do it. My mother said my name, the way she used to when she wanted to bring me back into alignment. My father said nothing. My sister looked at me with a mix of frustration and something else I couldn't name. I walked out. The door closed behind me with a sound that felt final in a way I hadn't anticipated. Outside, the air felt sharp. I stood by my car, hands on the roof, grounding myself in the cold metal. My phone buzzed almost immediately. Messages began to come in, layered with concern and reproach. You didn't have to leave like that. Can we talk? You're overreacting. I didn't respond. I needed to feel the full weight of what I had just done without explanation cushioning it. As I drove away, something unexpected happened. Relief. It moved through me slowly, cautiously, as if unsure it was allowed. Beneath it was fear, not of consequences, but of permanence. I knew, with a certainty that startled me, that I could not go back to the version of myself that made this kind of compromise. That version had been built for survival, not truth. That night, I didn't sleep much. My mind replayed the scene, not to critique my words, but to register the reality of it. The way no one had followed me. The way the house had resumed its quiet once I left. The way my absence had been absorbed without disruption. This hurt more than I expected. Not because I wanted to be chased, but because it confirmed what I had always sensed. My role had been to adjust. Without me, the system remained intact. In the days that followed, the messages continued. They were framed as concern, but carried an undercurrent of urgency. Let's clear the air. This is tearing the family apart. We can't move forward like this. The irony was not lost on me. Moving forward had never required my input before. Now that I was refusing to participate silently, movement felt impossible. In the middle of all this, I noticed something else. The absence of self-doubt. The familiar spiral of questioning my perception did not appear. I missed it. In a strange way, it had been a constant companion for so long. Its absence was disorienting. In its place was a steady, grounded knowing, not dramatic, not triumphant, just solid. If you've ever reached a point where explaining yourself stopped feeling useful, you might recognize that shift. It's not anger. It's fatigue giving way to clarity. Work became a refuge, not as an escape, but as a space where my boundaries made sense. Where saying no didn't require justification. Where impact was measured by outcomes, not harmony. I poured myself into it, not to avoid my feelings, but because it aligned with who I was becoming. The contrast between those environments sharpened my understanding. One demanded my erasure, the other respected my presence. Still, the tension with my family hovered. It didn't resolve itself. It waited. Each unanswered message carried the implication that this was temporary, that eventually I would soften. That time would restore the old equilibrium. I understood then that my refusal to engage was being interpreted not as a boundary, but as a phase. That realization clarified my next steps more than any confrontation could have. I began to articulate, to myself first, what I needed in order to continue any form of relationship. Not demands, conditions, acknowledgement, accountability, a willingness to sit with discomfort rather than smoothing it over. As I named these internally, I recognized how unlikely they were to be met. This didn't devastate me, it freed me. Hope is heavy when it's misplaced. There was grief in this phase, but it was different from what I had known before. It wasn't sharp, it didn't come in waves. It was quiet and persistent. Like a low hum, I grieved not just what had happened, but what would never happen. The conversations that would never occur. The recognition that would never be offered. The version of family I had once imagined and slowly released. At the same time, something else was taking shape. A sense of authorship over my own life. Decisions no longer filtered through the question of how they would land with my family. That question had governed me for so long that its absence felt like standing in open space. Unprotected, unrestricted. I didn't yet know what I would do with that space. I only knew that I could not fill it with silence again. The choice I had made in that living room had set something in motion. Not an explosion, but a reorientation. And as uncomfortable as it was, I sensed that this was not the end of the story. It was the moment everything finally turned. In the weeks that followed, the absence of noise became its own presence. No confrontations, no dramatic fallout, just a steady, low-level pressure that settled into my days. I would wake up and feel it before I remembered why. A weight without sharp edges. The kind that doesn't demand attention, but never fully leaves. My family's messages shifted in tone. At first, they were frequent and reactive. Then they became measured, thoughtful, even carefully worded attempts to reopen dialogue without touching substance. My mother suggested coffee. My father asked how work was going. My sister sent a photo from a weekend trip. As if continuity itself could mend what had fractured. None of them mentioned him. None of them acknowledged the decision they had made. The silence was intentional. It was also telling. I noticed how my body responded to each notification. Not fear, not anger. A brief tightening, followed by clarity. The clarity came faster each time. It told me what I was not willing to do anymore. It told me that conversation without accountability was not connection. It was maintenance. And I was done maintaining something that required my quiet compliance. At the same time, my inner world felt louder than it ever had. Without the constant background task of self-monitoring for my family. Thoughts surfaced unfiltered. Memories rose without being immediately dismissed. I found myself revisiting moments I had minimized for years. Not to relive them, but to reframe them. To see them without the old obligation to be fair to everyone else first. I noticed how often I had been praised for my restraint. How frequently I had been rewarded for making things easier. I had mistaken that reward for love. It was a sobering realization. Not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. Love does not require you to disappear. It does not depend on your silence. It does not ask you to carry what others refuse to look at. This understanding didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, in fragments. In conversations with colleagues, in quiet moments during my commute, in the way my shoulders relaxed when I imagined a future that did not include managing my family's comfort. That image felt both liberating and terrifying. Liberation always does when you're not used to it. Work continued to expand in ways that felt aligned rather than distracting. The platform we were building reached more people. Messages came in from women describing experiences that mirrored my own. Though the details differed, the common thread was familiar. Being doubted by default, being told to soften the truth, being praised for strength that had been forged in neglect. I read every message carefully. Not as a savior, as a witness. These stories didn't overwhelm me. They anchored me. They reminded me that my experience was not isolated. That patterns repeat not because individuals fail, but because systems reward certain behaviors. Silence, compliance, emotional labor performed quietly. Seeing this clearly made it harder to accept it in my own life. Once you recognize a pattern, participating in it feels like a choice, not a condition. There were moments when I missed my family intensely. Not the reality of them, but the idea, the version I had hoped might emerge if I waited long enough or explained myself better. That longing didn't disappear just because I understood its futility. It existed alongside my resolve, not in opposition to it. I learned that clarity does not cancel grief. It simply gives it context. I began to experiment with a different way of relating. Even in my thoughts, instead of asking what I owed my family, I asked what I owed myself. The question felt radical at first, selfish, even, but when I examined it honestly, I realized how rarely I had applied that lens before. Responsibility had always pointed outward. Inward responsibility was something I was still learning to claim. One afternoon, my mother called unexpectedly. I didn't answer, not out of avoidance, but out of discernment. I listened to the voicemail later. Her voice was steady, controlled. She said she was worried. She said families go through phases. She said she hoped we could talk soon. There was no mention of change, no acknowledgement of harm, just a gentle pull back toward normalcy. I deleted the message without responding. The decision felt quiet and firm. That evening, I noticed a subtle shift. The absence of immediate guilt. It didn't mean I felt nothing. It meant I didn't feel wrong. That distinction mattered. For years, guilt had been my default response to boundary setting. Even internal boundaries. Its absence was unfamiliar. It created space. In that space, I could hear myself more clearly. I started to articulate, privately, what acknowledgement would actually require. Not apologies crafted to restore comfort. Not explanations framed as misunderstandings. Real acknowledgement would mean naming choices, accepting consequences, sitting with discomfort without rushing to resolution. As I imagined these conversations, I felt a mix of sadness and realism. I could see how unlikely they were to occur. Not because my family was incapable of growth, but because growth would require them to dismantle a narrative that had protected them for decades. This realization didn't harden me. It softened something else, my expectations. I stopped waiting for moments of recognition. I stopped scanning for signs of change. I allowed myself to accept the relationship as it was, rather than as I wished it to be. Acceptance, in this sense, was not reconciliation. It was clarity without pursuit. As weeks turned into months, my family's attempts to reconnect grew less frequent. The urgency faded. The system recalibrated. This, more than anything, confirmed what I had already known. My role had been central only as long as I performed it. Once I stepped out of it, the structure adjusted. That knowledge hurt. It also freed me from illusions. I turned my attention more fully toward building a life that did not revolve around managing other people's discomfort. I invested in friendships that felt reciprocal. I spent time in environments where my presence was not conditional. These choices were not dramatic. They were consistent, and over time, consistency reshaped my sense of self. There were still moments of doubt, not about my decision, but about its permanence. I wondered if I was being too rigid, if time might soften things in ways I couldn't yet see. These thoughts came and went. I didn't chase them, I let them pass. Experience had taught me that doubt does not always signal error. Sometimes it simply signals unfamiliar territory. One evening, I found myself reflecting on the version of me who had sat at that kitchen table years earlier. Choosing words carefully, hoping for understanding, I felt tenderness toward her. Not pity, respect. She had done the best she could with what she knew. She had survived by adapting. That adaptation had kept her alive. It was no longer necessary. Honoring that did not mean returning to it. The realization that adaptation is not the same as alignment settled deeply. I had spent so long adapting that alignment felt like rebellion. But rebellion implies opposition. This was something quieter, a realignment toward myself, toward a way of living that did not require me to shrink to fit. As my internal world stabilized, I noticed how my energy changed. I was less vigilant, less reactive. I didn't rehearse conversations in advance as often. I trusted myself to respond in the moment. This trust was new. It grew slowly, reinforced by small experiences of choosing myself and surviving the outcome. I did not confront my family again during this time. Not because I was avoiding conflict, but because I understood that clarity does not always require repetition. I had said what I needed to say. Their response had been clear. Further explanation would not change the underlying dynamic. I chose not to invest energy where there was no capacity to receive it. This phase of my life was not triumphant. It was quiet. It involved letting go of fantasies and tolerating ambiguity. It required patience with myself as I adjusted to a new internal landscape. I learned that strength does not always look like endurance. Sometimes it looks like refusal. I also learned that boundaries are not punishments. They are descriptions. They describe what I will and will not participate in. They do not require agreement to be valid. This understanding allowed me to release the need for my family to understand my choices in order for them to stand. There were days when I felt deeply grounded. There were days when grief resurfaced unexpectedly. Both were part of the process. Healing, I discovered, is not linear. It is layered. Each layer reveals something new, something previously obscured by urgency or fear. As this period continued, I sensed that another shift was approaching. Not a confrontation, but a redefinition. I was no longer reacting to my family. I was orienting myself toward what came next. The work I was doing. The relationships I was nurturing. The values I was clarifying. These elements were beginning to cohere into something that felt like a foundation rather than a response. I didn't yet know how this foundation would be tested. I only knew that the version of me who would face that test would not be the one who had learned to survive by disappearing. She would be someone else. Someone who had learned, slowly and deliberately, to stay. The turning point did not arrive as a confrontation. It arrived as an invitation. An email from a hospital foundation I'd collaborated with before, asking if I would speak at a small mental health symposium. It was meant to be low-key. A panel discussion, mostly clinicians and community organizers. I almost declined. Public speaking still carried a residue of exposure for me. A sense that visibility required armor. What changed my mind was a line buried in the message. The event would be hosted by the same medical center where my mother volunteered. I sat with that information longer than I expected. Not because I feared seeing her, but because I sensed what the invitation represented. This was not about proximity. It was about alignment. I had built something meaningful. Something that existed independently of my family's narrative. The idea of presenting that work in a space connected to them felt like a test I hadn't consciously prepared for. Not of courage, but of coherence. Could I stand fully in who I had become without shrinking? Without explaining? Without managing the fallout? I accepted. In the weeks leading up to the event, I noticed how differently my body responded compared to similar situations in the past. There was anticipation, but not dread. Focus, not vigilance. I prepared my remarks carefully, but not defensively. I didn't script explanations for my personal history. I didn't preemptively soften my language. I centered the work, the data, the patterns I had observed across hundreds of stories. The implications for how we treat women's testimony in clinical and familial settings. As the date approached, my family remained silent. No mention of the event. No acknowledgement that they knew I would be there. I suspected they did. My mother's social circle overlapped with the foundation's. Information traveled easily in those spaces. The silence felt deliberate, a decision not to acknowledge a reality that complicated the preferred version of things. I let it be. The day of the symposium was unremarkable on the surface. Neutral room, folding chairs, coffee that tasted slightly burnt. The kind of event that lives or dies on the substance of its conversations rather than its presentation. I arrived early, checked in, reviewed the schedule. My name was listed alongside clinicians and researchers I respected. Seeing it there produced a quiet satisfaction. Not pride exactly. Confirmation. When I took my seat on the panel, I scanned the room without searching for familiar faces. It wasn't avoidance. It was intention. I wanted to speak from the center of my work, not from the edges of my history. As the discussion unfolded, something surprising happened. I forgot about my family entirely. I answered questions. I listened. I responded thoughtfully. I felt present in a way that didn't require monitoring. Then, midway through the session, I noticed movement near the back of the room. My mother had arrived. She sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the panel. I registered her presence without reacting to it. This was new. In the past, her attention would have pulled me off center, recalibrated my tone, redirected my focus. This time, it did not. I continued speaking, unchanged. The topic shifted to credibility, to how often women are asked to contextualize harm in ways that preserve institutional comfort. I spoke about patterns I had seen, about the cost of being disbelieved by default. I didn't reference my own experience. I didn't need to. The work carried its own authority. As I spoke, I noticed my mother's posture change. She leaned forward slightly. Her expression tightened, then softened. I did not interpret it. I let it exist without assignment. After the panel ended, people approached me with questions. Conversations extended into the hallway. Cards were exchanged. Follow-ups discussed. The energy was professional, focused, affirming. My mother waited until the crowd thinned. She approached slowly, as if uncertain whether she was welcome. When she reached me, she said my name, not the summoning tone, not the corrective one, just my name. She told me she hadn't realized the scope of my work. She said she was proud. The word landed oddly, not because it was unwelcome, but because it arrived without context. Pride offered without acknowledgement felt incomplete. I thanked her. I did not elaborate. She paused, as if waiting for something else. An opening, a reconciliation cue. I didn't provide one. She said it had been hard. The past few months. She said families make mistakes. She said she hoped we could find our way back to each other. I listened. I noticed my breathing remain steady. I noticed the absence of urgency. When she finished, I told her that I was open to conversations grounded in honesty and accountability. That I wasn't interested in restoring appearances. That any relationship moving forward would need to be different from what it had been. She nodded. She said she understood. I did not ask her to explain. Understanding, I had learned, is demonstrated over time, not declared in moments. We parted politely. No promises were made, no timelines set. I felt neither victorious nor defeated. I felt clear. In the days that followed, I reflected on that interaction more than I expected. Not because it unsettled me, but because it illustrated something important. I had not needed to demand recognition. I had not needed to narrate my pain. I had simply shown up as myself. That presence had altered the dynamic without confrontation. It had revealed the gap between words and change. Shortly after, my sister reached out. A long message, careful, apologetic in tone, though vague in content. She said she had been thinking a lot. That seeing me speak had made her realize things she hadn't before. She said she wanted to talk. I read the message several times. I noticed how it centered her realization rather than my experience. How it gestured toward insight without naming harm. I did not respond immediately. I took my time. I considered what I wanted, not what was expected. I wrote back days later. I told her I appreciated the message. I told her I was not ready for conversation without specificity and accountability. I told her that if she wanted to talk, she would need to name what she was taking responsibility for. I wished her well. I did not soften the boundary. She did not reply. That silence, too, was information. It clarified what was possible and what was not. It allowed me to release another layer of expectation. Each release felt like setting something down I had been carrying for too long. Not with relief. Exactly, with acceptance. Around this time, the platform I had built reached a new milestone. We partnered with additional clinics, expanded access, collected more data. The impact became harder to ignore. I was invited to contribute to policy discussions, to write, to consult. My work was shaping conversations I once felt excluded from. This expansion did not feel like vindication. It felt like alignment, like the natural result of sustained effort and clarity of purpose. As my professional life grew, so did my sense of internal stability. I no longer measured my worth against familial recognition. I no longer waited for permission to take up space. This shift did not erase longing. It contextualized it. Longing no longer dictated my choices. It became one feeling among many, not the axis around which everything turned. There was a moment, late one evening, when I sat alone in my apartment and realized how quiet my mind felt. Not empty, uncluttered, the constant internal dialogue, the rehearsal of explanations, the anticipation of misunderstanding, had softened. In its place was a steadier awareness. I trusted myself, not because I had all the answers, but because I believed my own perceptions. If you're still here with me, you don't need to agree with every choice I've made to understand what this shift required. Staying present through someone else's process can be its own kind of courage. I began to understand that the true turning point had not been the family gathering or the decision to leave. It had been the gradual relocation of authority, from external validation to internal alignment, from hoping to be understood to knowing what I needed regardless of who could offer it. This relocation was quiet. It did not announce itself. It simply changed how I moved through the world. My family remained at a distance. Not severed, not reconciled, suspended in a state that reflected reality rather than aspiration. I stopped framing this as loss. It was limitation. Some relationships have limits that cannot be negotiated without harm. Accepting that is not failure. It is discernment. As this understanding settled, I felt something new emerge. Not closure, but readiness. Readiness to articulate what I stood for without referencing what I stood against. Readiness to define myself without contrast. This readiness did not erase the past. It integrated it. I sensed that the next phase of my life would ask something different of me. Not endurance, not explanation, assertion, presence, consistency. I didn't yet know how that would unfold. I only knew that I was no longer orienting myself around repair. I was orienting myself around truth. After that period of readiness settled in, life didn't suddenly become simpler. It became clearer. And clarity, I learned, has its own demands. It asks you to act in alignment even when doing so removes familiar reference points. It asks you to tolerate the discomfort of not being misread in ways that once felt safe. One of the first things I noticed was how often people expected me to explain myself when I no longer felt the need to. Not just my family, colleagues, acquaintances, even well-meaning friends. They would ask why I didn't just smooth things over. Why I didn't keep the peace. Why I didn't try harder to repair what looked broken from the outside. I listened. I answered selectively. I stopped translating my decisions into something more digestible. This wasn't defiance. It was conservation. I was learning where my energy belonged. There is a particular moment in personal change when you realize you've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. It's not dramatic. No alarms go off. You simply recognize that you are no longer willing to pay the old price for belonging. That recognition came to me gradually. Through repetition. Each time I chose not to respond immediately. Each time I declined an invitation that came with unspoken expectations. Each time I held a boundary without filling the silence that followed. At first, those silences were loud. They hummed with imagined judgment, with the ghosts of reactions I had learned to anticipate. Over time, they softened. They became neutral, just space. I began to notice how much of my previous life had been organized around preempting disappointment. I had been so skilled at predicting other people's reactions that I rarely allowed myself to be surprised. That skill had protected me, but it had also narrowed my world. Now, without it guiding every decision, things felt less predictable. That unpredictability was unsettling. It was also alive. In therapy, we talked about differentiation, about the process of becoming emotionally separate without becoming disconnected from yourself. I realized how often I had conflated separation with abandonment. If I wasn't actively managing relationships, I assumed they would collapse. What I was learning instead was that relationships which require constant management are already unstable. They just outsource that instability to the most adaptable person in the system. This insight reframed so much of my history that it felt like adjusting a lens. The image didn't change, my understanding of it did. I could see now how early my role had been established, how my compliance had been interpreted as agreement, how my silence had been mistaken for consent. None of this made my family malicious. It made the dynamic clear. Clarity continued to show up in unexpected places. In meetings where I stated a boundary and watched the room adjust instead of collapse. In friendships where I expressed a need and found it met without negotiation. These moments accumulated, reinforcing a new internal truth. I was not difficult. I was direct. I was not withdrawing. I was choosing. My family, meanwhile, hovered at the edges of my awareness. They did not disappear. They remained present in indirect ways. Mentions through mutual contacts. Occasional updates filtered through extended relatives. I did not seek these out. But I didn't shut them down either. I let information arrive without assigning it meaning. This neutrality felt like progress. There was one conversation, months later, that tested everything I had learned. My father called. He rarely did. When he did, it was usually to pass along information or confirm logistics. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Less certain. He said he wanted to talk. Just the two of us. I considered saying no, not because I was afraid, but because I understood the weight of that choice. Saying yes meant engaging without knowing what would be offered. Saying no meant honoring the distance I had created. I said yes, with conditions. We would meet in a public place. We would not avoid the past. We would not rush resolution. We met at a quiet cafe. He arrived early. I noticed that immediately. It suggested intention. When I sat down, he looked at me for a long moment before speaking. Not critically, not approvingly, just looking, as if he were recalibrating an image that no longer fit. He told me he had been thinking a lot. He told me he hadn't understood the impact of his silence when I was younger. He said he had believed neutrality was safer than taking sides. As he spoke, I felt something unexpected, not anger, not relief, a careful attention. I listened for accountability. I listened for deflection. I listened without bracing. He acknowledged that not choosing had been a choice. That by prioritizing calm, he had failed to protect. The words mattered, not because they erased anything, but because they named something real. I told him what that silence had taught me, how it had shaped my understanding of myself. I did not soften it. I did not dramatize it. I spoke plainly. He did not interrupt. He did not defend himself. He did not ask me to understand his intentions. He said he was sorry. Not in a way that demanded forgiveness. In a way that accepted consequence. That conversation did not fix our relationship. It altered its shape. We did not leave with plans. We did not promise to talk more often. We acknowledged what had been broken and what could not be repaired. We agreed to move forward slowly. Without assumptions. It was the most honest interaction we had ever had. When I left the cafe, I felt grounded, not elated, not hollow, grounded. The conversation had not compromised my boundaries. It had respected them. That distinction mattered more than outcome. With my mother and sister, no such conversations followed. The contrast was instructive. It showed me that willingness, not time, determines whether repair is possible. This understanding allowed me to stop measuring progress by uniformity. Different relationships required different truths. As I integrated these experiences, I noticed how my internal narrative changed. I stopped framing my life as a reaction to what I had survived. I began to see it as something I was actively shaping. The past remained part of the story, but it was no longer the organizing principle. This shift affected how I approached my work as well. I became more precise in my language, less concerned with being palatable, more focused on accuracy. I advocated for policies that centered lived experience without forcing it into neat frameworks. I challenged assumptions that equated calm with health and disruption with dysfunction. These positions were not always comfortable for institutions. They were necessary. The more I aligned my professional voice with my personal clarity, the less fragmented I felt. I was no longer translating myself across contexts. I was showing up as the same person, adjusted for audience but not diluted in essence. That consistency brought a sense of integrity I had never experienced before. There were still moments of grief. They arrived quietly, often triggered by small things. A family photograph online, a holiday passing without contact. I let those moments exist without turning them into conclusions. Grief, I learned, does not mean regret. It means attachment, and attachment, even when unreciprocated, is not something to be ashamed of. What had changed was my relationship to that grief. It no longer dictated my behavior. It informed it. I could feel loss without chasing replacement. I could miss people without returning to harm. As this phase of my life unfolded, I recognized that the turning point I had expected, the dramatic resolution or decisive break, had never come. Instead, there had been a series of quieter decisions, each one small on its own. Together, irreversible, they had reoriented my life not through force, but through accumulation. I also noticed something else. I was no longer waiting. Not for apologies, not for recognition, not for closure. Waiting had once been a central activity in my emotional life. Now it felt unnecessary. I was moving. The foundation of my life felt different now. Not because everything was resolved, but because it was coherent. My choices aligned with my values. My relationships reflected my boundaries. My work mirrored my convictions. This coherence did not eliminate pain. It gave it a place to land without destabilizing everything else. I understood then that the most profound shift had not been external. It had been the internal relocation of trust. I trusted myself to know when something was wrong. I trusted myself to respond without justification. I trusted myself to tolerate the discomfort that came with change. This trust was not blind confidence. It was earned, built through repetition, through surviving the consequences of my choices and discovering that survival did not require self-betrayal. That knowledge settled deeply, becoming part of how I moved through the world. I sensed that the next phase would not be about confrontation or repair. It would be about affirmation. About naming what I stood for without referencing what I had endured. About claiming a sense of self that was not provisional, not conditional, fully present. I didn't rush toward that phase. I let it approach me at its own pace. The work I had done had taught me the value of timing. Of not forcing resolution where integration was still unfolding. I allowed myself to inhabit the space I had created, to feel its contours, to trust its stability. What I knew, with a certainty that no longer wavered, was this: I would not return to the version of myself who equated love with endurance. I would not confuse silence with strength again. Whatever came next would be built on something different, something solid, something true. There is a difference between ending a story and arriving at a truth. Endings suggest closure, resolution, a neat tying together of loose threads. Truth is less tidy. It settles, it integrates, it changes how you stand in your own life. What I reached was not an ending, but a position, a place from which I could finally speak without checking whether the ground beneath me would give way. Affirmation, I learned, is not something you wait to receive. It is something you practice until it becomes internal. For most of my life, affirmation had been externalized. I looked for it in approval, in ease, in the absence of conflict. If no one objected, I assumed I was doing something right. If no one asked questions, I assumed I had explained myself well enough. This logic had shaped my behavior more than I realized. It had also kept me in constant negotiation with imagined reactions. The shift happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. I stopped measuring my choices by how they would be received and started measuring them by how they felt in my body. This was not instinctual at first. It required practice. I had to learn the difference between anxiety and misalignment, between fear of conflict and genuine concern. These sensations can feel similar when you've spent years overriding them. What surprised me was how reliable my internal signals became once I started listening. There was a steadiness that emerged when I acted in alignment. Even difficult decisions carried a sense of rightness. Not relief, not ease, rightness. It was subtle, but unmistakable. I had never trusted that feeling before. Now, it became my reference point. As this trust grew, I noticed how little I needed to explain myself. Not because I was withholding, but because my decisions no longer required justification to feel legitimate. I didn't owe anyone a narrative that made my boundaries comfortable. I didn't owe coherence to people who had never carried the cost of my incoherence. This realization was not bitter. It was liberating. I also became more precise in how I understood forgiveness. For a long time, I believed forgiveness was synonymous with reconciliation. That to forgive meant to restore access, to lower boundaries, to reopen doors. This belief kept me stuck, waiting for internal readiness that never came. What I learned instead was that forgiveness can be internal and unilateral. It can be the release of bitterness without the restoration of trust. It can coexist with distance. Forgiving my family did not require me to resume old patterns. It required me to stop letting resentment govern my internal world. That process was uneven. Some days, forgiveness felt natural. Other days, it felt theoretical. I stopped treating it as a moral obligation and started treating it as a personal choice. One that could change over time. The most profound affirmation I reached was this: I was not wrong for wanting more. Not more attention, not more validation, more honesty, more protection, more accountability. These desires were not excessive. They were reasonable. The fact that they could not be met within my family system did not invalidate them. It clarified where they belonged. This clarity transformed how I viewed my past. I no longer framed my younger self as naive or overly sensitive. I saw her as perceptive. She had noticed things early. She had named them quietly. She had adapted because adaptation was the only option available to her. That adaptation had been intelligent. It had also been temporary. There was no shame in outgrowing it. I began to speak differently about my story, even internally, not as a narrative of damage, but as one of development. Trauma had shaped me, yes, but it had not defined my values. My values had been present all along. Fairness, integrity, care. What changed was my willingness to uphold them even when it disrupted relationships. This willingness extended into every area of my life. Friendships deepened as I showed up without pretense. Some connections fell away when they could not accommodate my clarity. I let them go without dramatizing the loss. Not every ending needs to be mourned publicly. Some are simply acknowledged and released. Romantic relationships shifted as well. I no longer mistook emotional distance for safety. I no longer equated intensity with intimacy. I paid attention to how I felt after interactions, not just during them. Did I feel expanded or contracted? Calm or vigilant? These questions guided me more reliably than any checklist. Professionally, affirmation took the form of conviction. I spoke with greater authority. Not because I knew everything, but because I trusted my perspective. I challenged assumptions without apologizing for discomfort. I named patterns without diluting their impact. I was no longer interested in being agreeable at the expense of accuracy. This did not make me inflexible. It made me grounded. Grounded people can listen without collapsing. They can revise without erasing themselves. They can hold nuance without disappearing into it. This grounding became the foundation of my leadership, both within my organization and in the broader conversations I participated in. There were moments when I reflected on what my life might have looked like if things had been different. If I had been believed earlier. If protection had been offered when it was needed. These reflections did not spiral into regret. They felt more like parallel possibilities. Acknowledged and set aside. I did not need to live them to honor them. I also reflected on the concept of family more broadly. How often it is framed as unconditional. How rarely that condition is examined. I came to believe that unconditional love, when demanded without accountability, becomes a tool of control. True care allows for boundaries. It respects withdrawal as much as presence. It understands that access is earned through behavior, not assumed through title. This belief did not isolate me. It connected me to people who understood it intuitively. Chosen family emerged not through declaration, but through consistency. People who showed up. People who listened without agenda. People who could hold my truth without rushing to fix it. These relationships were not perfect. They were real. As I moved further into this phase of affirmation, I noticed something else. I was no longer orienting myself around what I was avoiding. I wasn't avoiding conflict. I wasn't avoiding my family. I wasn't avoiding pain. I was moving toward alignment. That orientation changed the emotional tone of my life. It replaced vigilance with intention. There is a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you will not abandon yourself. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need reinforcement. It shows up in small decisions. In the way you say no. In the way you pause before responding. In the way you trust your timing. I experienced this confidence most clearly in moments of ambiguity. When there was no clear right answer. When outcomes were uncertain, I could tolerate not knowing. I could choose without guarantees. This tolerance was new. It marked a significant departure from the person I had been trained to be. I also noticed how my relationship to memory changed. Memories no longer arrived as accusations or proof. They arrived as information. I could recall events without reliving them. I could name harm without being consumed by it. This shift did not erase emotional charge entirely. It made it manageable. One of the final affirmations I reached was this: my story does not require consensus. It does not need to be validated by those who were unwilling to witness it. Its truth stands independent of acknowledgement. This understanding freed me from the last remnants of performative clarity. I no longer needed my pain to be legible to others in order for it to matter. This does not mean I stopped caring how my actions affected people. Care remained central to who I was. What changed was its direction. I no longer prioritized the comfort of systems over the well-being of individuals, including myself. I understood that care without boundaries becomes self-sacrifice. And self-sacrifice, when demanded, is not virtue. As I look at my life now, I see coherence, not perfection, not completion. Coherence. My values align with my choices. My boundaries align with my needs. My work aligns with my convictions. This alignment is not static. It requires attention, but it is sustainable. There are still moments when the old reflexes surface. The urge to explain, the instinct to soften. I notice them without judgment. They are remnants of a strategy that once kept me safe. I thank them for their service and choose differently. This practice feels respectful, not corrective. I am often asked whether I would do anything differently if given the chance. It is a complicated question. I would not wish my experiences on anyone. At the same time, I would not trade the clarity they produced. I would not return to the version of myself who believed survival required disappearance. What I know now is this: strength is not measured by how much you endure in silence. It is measured by how honestly you respond to what you know. It is measured by your willingness to protect yourself when no one else will. It is measured by your capacity to choose alignment over approval. Affirmation, in the end, is not a feeling. It is a stance, a way of standing in your own life without apology, without justification, without waiting. I stand there now, not above my past, not erased from it, integrated. I carry what shaped me without letting it dictate me. I honor what I needed without demanding it from those who could not give it. If there is one truth I hold with certainty, it is this: I belong to myself. That belonging is not conditional. It is not negotiable. It is not something that can be revoked by misunderstanding or withheld by silence. From that place, everything else becomes possible. Today, my life looks quieter than it once did, and that quiet feels earned. My days are steady. My work continues to grow in ways that feel aligned rather than exhausting. I wake up without bracing myself for messages I don't want to read. I go to sleep without replaying conversations I wish had gone differently. There is space in my mind now. Space to think, to feel, to rest. The people who are close to me know who I am, not who I perform. I move through my life without the constant effort of adjusting myself to fit into places that were never built for me. That freedom is not loud. It's calm, and it's real. Looking back, I don't see my story as one about loss anymore. I see it as a story about choosing alignment over approval. About learning that peace doesn't come from keeping everything together, but from being honest about what no longer holds. I learned that love without accountability slowly erodes the self, and that boundaries are not walls meant to punish others. They are bridges back to yourself. I learned that silence can look like strength, but it often carries the cost of invisibility. And I learned that healing doesn't require everyone to understand you. It requires you to understand yourself. If you're listening to this and parts of it feel uncomfortably familiar, I want you to know something. There is nothing wrong with you for feeling tired of explaining. There is nothing broken about you for needing distance, or clarity, or time. You are not weak for wanting safety, consistency, and respect from the people who are supposed to care for you. And you are not cruel for choosing yourself when no one else will. Whatever pace you're moving at right now is allowed. You don't have to forgive on a schedule. You don't have to confront anyone before you're ready. You don't have to turn your pain into something meaningful for it to be valid. Surviving is already meaningful. You are allowed to build a life that feels calmer than the one you came from. You are allowed to choose relationships that don't require you to disappear. And you are allowed to trust the quiet voice inside you that knows when something is no longer right. That voice has been with you longer than anyone else. It deserves your attention. If this story stayed with you, if it reflected something you've lived or are still living, you're welcome to stay a little longer. There are more stories ahead, each one holding a different piece of healing. And I'd be glad to have you with me for the next one.